Hello. Thought we'd take a moment to celebrate VE Day, 75th anniversary, this very day. And I have a few things in the house that remind me of the war and the battles and the people, especially my grandparents. All of them served in different ways during the war. And my grandfather I was closest to served aboard HMS Belfast, which we see here from 1942. This is a photograph I was given on my wedding day by my uncle and godfather. And it was a very small clipping, and it says in the corner, "Lots of love, Les," in my granddad's hand. He gave this when my uncle was a boy, a picture of this same picture with the note, and my uncle had it blown up and framed and gave me on my wedding day so that my late grandfather would in some little way be with us. So this is the Belfast in 42. Very different to how she looks on the Thames today. You can still go and visit the Belfast. She's the last big gun warship of the Royal Navy from World War II. She also, of course, served in Korea. She had lots of modernisation after this picture was taken, but you will still see the gun positions on the cheeks of the bridge area. Well, my grandfather's battle position was the opposite side, the rear of the two sets of guns. That was his actual position. Today it's a single barrel Orlican by the look of it, and at the time he had a 4-barrel pom-pom. So he was a loader for that weapon. He was also an electrician aboard the ship and served on her from the time she returned to service until right after the war. He was at D-Day, he was fighting in the Far East, but crucially he was aboard her during the Battle of the North Cape. He was a veteran of the Battle of the North Cape, and so he saw, the last big battle between battleships in the North Sea, in the Atlantic, really, and certainly the last big gun fight that the Royal Navy was in. I believe it's the last time that ships were sunk purely ship to ship or something. So the Battle of the North Cape is something that I tend to mention every year to myself. During the D-Day 50th anniversaries, when he saw the Belfast be sent to stage, she fired a salvo in salute. He was just thrilled, and I'll never forget when he was so excited to talk to me about it. He had some stories about the ship in the Mediterranean, chasing down an Italian ship. There was also some damage taken. I'm not sure which, but one of the two funnels was struck by a shell that went through the funnel, and I believe he was on this side of the ship, and shrapnel hit him in the arm, so he was injured on that day in the Mediterranean on that patrol. So he had many stories to tell. I think his favourite place when they visited was New Zealand. But they went to Japan. He, saw a defeated Japan after VE Day, so they carried on serving way off that mark. And so that was my grandfather Les. My other grandfather was my grandfather George, who had a longer and arguably more varied war. He was a professional soldier at the outbreak of war in 1939, so he'd already joined up and been through training, and spent time in France, and then was withdrawn after Dynamo to guard England and the home nation. He soon then went to Scotland, and while he was in Scotland, a gentleman from Germany appeared in a Messerschmitt 110 and crashed. A gentleman by the name of Rudolf Hess. And my grandfather was the sergeant of the guard of Rudolf Hess, and I have clippings that I will have to do as a follow-up video, perhaps, with more detail for you. But suffice to say that my grandfather was always a very even-handed man. If you treated him fine, he treated you fine. And as Rudolf Hess was polite and, officially still of a rank, he was polite to him, unlike other members of the guard. And indeed, when the story goes that when Mr. Hess was being moved from the property in Scotland for interrogation elsewhere, he refused to leave until he'd said goodbye to the polite sergeant, which was my grandfather. My grandfather then was also at D-Day. fought on the beaches. He actually landed on D-Day on the 6th of June 1944. So I had one grandfather firing covering shells over the top of the other, and the two obviously never ever knew each other, never met with that great operation, but they were both present. They then travelled, my grandfather George then travelled much inland. As I understand it, he fought at Caen under General Montgomery, Field Marshal Montgomery by that time, and ended his war on the German border. So on VE Day 1945, he was somewhere near the German border, with British forces moving up the coast from what was the follow over from Operation Market Garden, the flow up. So he did cross the Rhine. Post-war, I'm not sure what he'd done. His wife, my grandmother Mabel, she was a nurse. She actually, they married by special license, all very romantic, before he obviously undertook all these adventures into Europe. But she was a nurse, and she actually cared mainly or predominantly for American airmen. She would often tell of stories of their ghastly injuries, and even some of them that looked absolutely fine, and you'd open the aircraft and find them deceased. She was a nurse before the war, and she carried on being a nurse during the war, and after the war with my grandfather, had many children, my uncles and aunts, including my father. My other grandmother, she was in the land army. She was very young. She was the youngest of the lot. So my George and Mabel were both born in 1918. Les was born in 1921, but Mabel was born later, so she was only 9 at the outbreak of war. She was born 1930 or 1928. She was 10 at the outbreak of war, I believe. And so she spent much of the time in a very strange situation. She had a very broken home life. Her mother was very unwell. Her father became deaf, and the family was split up. The many brothers and sisters were split up, and she ended up in care. From care, though, as soon as she was of age, she volunteered for the Land Army and worked not untirelessly in a farm, I believe somewhere in the Norfolk Broads, certainly in East Anglia. And from there she ended up in King's Lynn at the end of the war, and she'd had my uncle at that time and met my grandfather after that fact. So she'd had an interesting war. I believe my uncle was the result of a liaison between a Canadian airman and herself. Always my uncle, no big deal about that for us. But that was the uncle that provided me the picture of the Belfast on my wedding day. So that's the brief history of my 4 grandparents' war. You have love, you have partnership, you have meetings of history, you have the great operations, the Battle of the North Cape, D-Day, the VE Day celebrations, and then of course Les was out at VJ Day, which is yet to come for its 75th anniversary. And the relic that is the Belfast is very important to me. I have been to see her, and I will include some photographs perhaps at the end of this video that I took. I've never been aboard her. I don't think I could face the ghosts because she was so important to my granddad. I've supported her. I've donated to the funds. I've bought books. Imperial War Museum books, but I've never been aboard the ship herself. So here we are, and we're going to celebrate VE Day, the day that really Britain and the free world showed its mettle against the tyranny and misjudgment of others. And friends that we are now, that deep rivalry remains between the nations of Europe, and I can only hope that after Brexit we remain friends, because I think we've earned it. Thank you for listening.